Captain Zephyr Kane had always believed that the universe held secrets worth dying for, but as her exploration vessel Meridian's Edge drifted through the Kepler 442 system, she never imagined those secrets would reshape the destiny of entire civilizations. The ship's quantum sensors had detected something impossible, a distress signal broadcasting on frequencies that predated human spaceflight by millennia, yet somehow seemed oddly familiar in its mathematical structure. "Captain, the signal's getting stronger," reported Dr. Serafina Voss from her xenobiology station, her dark eyes reflecting the amber glow of alien data streams cascading across her monitors. Serafina had spent 15 years studying theoretical alien communication patterns, but this was her first chance to analyze the real thing. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the translation algorithms, decades of academic preparation crystallizing into this singular moment. Thaddeus Marlowe, the ship's chief engineer, emerged from the maintenance crawlway with quantum lubricant staining his weathered hands. Unlike his colleagues who had joined the Deep Space Exploration Initiative for glory or discovery, Thad had signed up because he understood that in the vast emptiness between stars, a broken hyperdrive meant death, and someone had to keep the machines running. "Whatever's broadcasting that signal, it's putting out enough energy to power a small moon," he said, wiping his hands on his coveralls. "The interference is playing hell with our navigation systems." The Meridian's Edge was humanity's most advanced exploration vessel, equipped with experimental technology that pushed the boundaries of physics. Her crew of 12 represented Earth's finest minds, but they were utterly unprepared for what awaited them in the void. As they approached the signal source, their viewscreen revealed a sight that would haunt their dreams for years to come: a massive alien vessel, its crystalline hull shattered and bleeding atmosphere into space, drifting lifeless among the debris of what had once been a thriving space station. Zephyr felt her breath catch in her throat. The alien ship was beautiful in its destruction, its organic curves and flowing lines suggesting a civilization that valued artistry as much as function. But the blast pattern scarring its hull told a different story. This hadn't been an accident. Someone had attacked this vessel with weapons humanity couldn't even comprehend. "Serafina, are you picking up any life signs?" Zephyr asked, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. In all their simulations and training scenarios, first contact had always been with living beings, not the remnants of the dead. "Faint readings, Captain. Maybe 2 or 3 survivors, but their biosignatures are unlike anything in our databases." Serafina's fingers danced across her console, her xenobiology training finally being put to its ultimate test. "Whatever species this is, they're carbon-based but with significant silicon integration. Their life support systems are failing." Thad was already moving toward the airlock, his engineer's instincts overriding protocol. "I can jury-rig a power transfer, maybe buy them some time," he said, gathering portable fusion cells and emergency atmosphere recyclers. His thick hands, so clumsy with paperwork and pleasantries, moved with precise efficiency when lives hung in the balance. As the Meridian's Edge extended its docking umbilical toward the dying alien vessel, none of them could have predicted that this moment of humanitarian instinct would set in motion events that would echo across a dozen star systems. The survivors they were about to rescue belonged to the Nethys Collective, a peaceful trading confederation that had been brutally attacked by the expanding Vortak Empire. By saving these 3 beings, the humans were unknowingly choosing a side in a galactic war that had been raging for centuries. The airlock cycled open with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and Zephyr stepped through into an alien corridor lined with bioluminescent panels that pulsed weakly like a dying heartbeat. The air smelled of ozone and something floral that made her sinuses burn. Behind her, Serafina activated her universal translator, while Thad dragged emergency equipment through the umbilical. They found the survivors in what appeared to be the ship's command center, 2 beings that resembled a cross between spiders and mantises, their chitinous bodies gleaming with an oily rainbow sheen, tending to a third who lay motionless on a crystalline medical bed. The conscious aliens turned toward the humans with compound eyes that reflected fear, hope, and something that might have been wonder. "Please," one of them spoke through the translator, its voice a symphony of clicks and harmonics that somehow conveyed desperate urgency. Our hive singer Chitrixneth carries knowledge that must not die with us. The Vorthak seek to silence all who remember the old agreements, the treaties that bound the galaxy in peace. As Thad connected his equipment to their failing power grid and Seraphina began emergency medical procedures on the injured alien, Zephyr realized they had stumbled into something far greater than a rescue mission. The universe was about to test humanity's character, and their response would determine not just their own fate, but the fate of civilizations they had never dreamed existed. The rescued alien, who identified herself as Envoy Mishkavel, spoke in hurried harmonics while Seraphina worked to stabilize the injured hive singer. Her words painted a picture of a galaxy torn apart by the relentless expansion of the Vorthak Empire, a militaristic species that conquered through overwhelming technological superiority and absolute ruthlessness. For 3 centuries, they had systematically absorbed or destroyed every civilization they encountered, their massive dreadnoughts leaving only empty worlds and scattered refugees in their wake. The Vorthak believe that strength is the only truth, Mishkavel explained, her compound eyes tracking nervously toward the stars beyond the viewport. They see the diversity of galactic civilization as weakness to be purged. Your species, these humans, are unknown to us, but if the Vorthak discover you exist, they will come for your worlds as they came for ours. Chitrixneth, the injured hive singer, stirred on the medical bed as Seraphina's emergency treatments took effect. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate directly in their bones, a sound that conveyed not just words but emotions and images. Through the translator, her message was devastating in its simplicity. I carry the memory songs of the Kalos Concordat, the last alliance that stood against the Vorthak. 7 species united in common cause, and all 7 fell to the Empire's war machines. Thad had managed to restore partial power to the alien vessel, and the tactical displays around them flickered to life, showing star maps that revealed the true scope of the crisis. Red markers indicated Vorthak-controlled systems, a crimson tide that had engulfed nearly half the galaxy. The few remaining free systems were scattered islands of resistance, too isolated and disparate to mount any effective defense. Captain, Seraphina said quietly, I'm reading massive hyperspace distortions approaching this system. Multiple contacts, moving information. Her hands flew across the sensor controls, her face pale with the implications of what she was seeing. Whatever's coming, it's big enough to make our ship look like a shuttlecraft. Zephyr felt the familiar weight of command settle on her shoulders, but this decision would affect more than just her crew. The smart choice was to flee immediately, to return to Earth and warn humanity to hide among the vast emptiness of space. But looking at the injured aliens they had rescued, at the desperation in Mishkavel's compound eyes, she knew that hiding would only delay the inevitable. Thad, how quickly can we separate from their ship? She asked, her mind already calculating possibilities and risks. 2 minutes to safely disconnect all umbilicals, Captain. But their ship won't survive another hour without our power core. Thad's weathered face was grim with understanding. Saving the aliens meant staying to fight whatever was coming, and fighting meant almost certain death for all of them. The hyperspace distortions resolved into something that defied comprehension, a Vorthak dreadnought the size of a small city, its hull bristling with weapons that could crack planets. Escort vessels flanked it like predatory fish, their sleek forms radiating menace even across the vast distance of space. The formation moved with precise coordination that spoke of centuries of military experience and absolute confidence in their technological superiority. They're scanning us, Seraphina reported, her voice tight with controlled fear. I'm reading massive energy buildups across their weapon systems. Chitrixneth struggled to rise from the medical bed, her damaged limbs trembling with effort. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of ancient sorrow and desperate hope. The humans show the old virtues, courage without glory-seeking, compassion for strangers, sacrifice for principles. Perhaps the galaxy was not meant to die in silence after all. Mishkavel's harmonics took on an urgent tone. The dreadnought is commanded by Vorthak himself, the architect of 1,000 extinctions. He came personally to ensure our knowledge dies with us. But now, She paused, studying the humans with something approaching wonder. Now there are new variables in his equation. Zephyr looked at her crew, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. Serafina had dedicated her life to understanding alien minds, and now she faced the ultimate test of that understanding. Thad had always believed that machines existed to serve life, and he wouldn't abandon that principle now. They were 3 humans against an empire, but sometimes the universe demanded that someone stand witness to atrocity and say, no more. All hands to battle stations, Zephyr commanded, her voice carrying across the ship's intercom. Thad, I need everything you can give me from the engines. Serafina, help our guests transfer whatever data they can to our systems. If we're going to die here, we're going to make sure their knowledge survives us. As the Vorthak dreadnought closed distance, its weapons powering up with the lethal patience of absolute predators, the Meridian's edge turned to face them. She was one small ship carrying the hopes of dying civilizations and the untested courage of a species that had never faced true galactic warfare. But in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of alien dreams and the approaching shadow of empire, humanity took its first step toward becoming something more than explorers. They became hope. The Vorthak dreadnought's first volley lit up space like an artificial star, beams of coherent energy that could have vaporized a mountain range. But the Meridian's edge wasn't where the targeting computers expected her to be. Thad had overcharged the maneuvering thrusters beyond all safety parameters, sending the human ship into a spiraling dance that seemed to defy the laws of physics and common sense. Impossible, came the translated transmission from the Vorthak flagship, the voice carrying the cold authority of Commander Vorthak himself. No vessel that small possesses the power-to-mass ratio for such acceleration profiles. Zephyr smiled grimly as she threw the ship into another impossible turn, her hands dancing across controls that were never designed for combat maneuvers. That's because you've never met a human engineer who takes impossible as a personal challenge. Thad, please tell me you haven't broken anything too important. Just the safety interlocks, the manufacturer's warranties, and probably several laws of thermodynamics, Thad called back from engineering, his hands flying across emergency power routing systems. The good news is we've got about 10 minutes before the fusion core realizes what we're doing to it and decides to express its disapproval. Serafina worked frantically at her station, downloading memory crystals from Chitrixneth while simultaneously analyzing the Vorthak attack patterns. Her xenobiology training had taught her to think in terms of behavioral patterns and biological imperatives, and she was beginning to see something in the alien empire's tactics that others had missed. Captain, I think I understand why they're so successful, she said, her voice tight with concentration. They're not just militaristic, they're behaviorally incapable of adapting to unexpected variables. Look at their formation discipline. It's perfect, but it's also rigid. They can't conceive of opponents who don't follow logical tactical doctrines. Another volley of Vorthak fire sliced through space where the Meridian's edge had been microseconds before. The human ship's evasion pattern seemed random, chaotic, but there was method in the madness. Zephyr was flying by instinct and intuition, qualities that the mathematically precise Vorthak couldn't quantify or predict. Mishkavel watched the tactical display with something approaching religious awe. 17 civilizations have faced Vorthak in direct combat, she whispered through the translator. All 17 calculated the optimal response to his weapons and formations. All 17 died because they fought as he expected them to fight. Chitrixneth, despite her injuries, began to sing, a complex harmonic pattern that Serafina's equipment identified as a hive-mind communication protocol. But this wasn't just communication, it was memory itself, the living history of the Kalos Concordat being transmitted in real time to other Nethi survivors scattered across the galaxy. She's broadcasting everything, Serafina realized with growing excitement. Not just the data we're downloading, but what's happening here. The whole Nethi's collective is watching us fight. The Vorthak dreadnought began to change its attack pattern, its AI systems finally adapting to the human ship's erratic movements. Massive tractor beams lanced out, trying to hold the Meridian's edge still long enough for the main guns to find their mark. For a moment, it seemed the superior technology would win through sheer brute force. But Thad had one more surprise. "Captain, remember that experimental graviton pulse generator we picked up at the Titan research station? The one marked theoretical use only, not for field testing? The one that could theoretically create artificial gravity waves or theoretically tear a hole in spacetime?" Zephyr asked, already knowing where this was heading. "That's the one. I've been thinking that theoretical is just another word for hasn't been tried yet." Thad's grin was audible in his voice. "I can jury-rig it to the deflector array, but I can't predict what it'll do." "Do it," Zephyr commanded without hesitation. In the face of certain death, unpredictability was their only weapon. The graviton pulse, when it fired, didn't behave like any weapon should. Instead of destroying the Vorthack tractor beams, it seemed to twist them, creating localized distortions in spacetime that sent feedback cascading through the dreadnought systems. For the first time in 3 centuries of conquest, a Vorthack ship experienced what its countless victims had felt, the helplessness of superior technology turned against itself. "Status report," came Vorthack's transmission, his previously unshakable composure cracking with the first notes of uncertainty. His subordinates' responses carried growing alarm. "Unknown energy cascades in primary systems. Weapons targeting is degraded by 30%. Tractor beam generators are offline." But the victory was Pyrrhic. Thad's miracle had burned out half their systems, and the Meridian's edge was bleeding atmosphere and power. The escort vessels were closing in, their weapons charging for a final overwhelming barrage. "Captain," Chitrixneth said, her harmonics carrying a note of profound sadness and infinite gratitude, "you have shown the galaxy something it had forgotten, that courage needs no permission and that hope can exist even in the face of certain defeat. The memory songs will carry your names across the stars." As the Vorthack escorts prepared their final attack, Serafina made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in the ancient data they had rescued was something impossible, coordinates for a lost civilization, one that had vanished during the first Vorthack expansion but had never been confirmed destroyed. "Captain," she whispered, her voice shaking with the implications, "there are others. Survivors from the first conquests. And I think they've been waiting for someone to find them." The coordinates pointed to a system beyond the galactic rim, in the dark space between galaxies where no rational civilization would choose to hide. But rationality, as they had just proven, was overrated. The hyperspace jump that carried them away from the Vorthack dreadnought was the most desperate gamble of Zephyr's career. With their ship barely held together by emergency patches and Thad's increasingly creative interpretations of engineering safety protocols, they followed Chitrixneth's ancient coordinates into the dark space between galaxies. The Meridian's edge shuddered through dimensions that weren't meant to accommodate matter, while behind them, the galaxy burned with the fires of accelerating conquest. What they found in that impossible darkness defied every assumption about survival and civilization. The lost system hung in the void like a hidden jewel, its star artificially sustained by technology so advanced it seemed like magic. Orbital habitats ringed planets that should have been frozen wastelands, while massive structures channeled stellar energy with impossible efficiency. This was the sanctuary, the hidden refuge of the Luminar remnant, survivors of the first species to fall to Vorthack's expansion. Luminarch Kethari greeted them aboard a station that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions human science couldn't comprehend. She appeared as a being of living light contained within crystalline matrices, her thoughts transmitted through electromagnetic frequencies that bypassed the need for vocal communication entirely. "We have watched the galaxy die by degrees," Kethari communicated, her thoughts carrying the weight of 3 centuries of hidden observation. 700 species have fallen to the Vorthack since our own civilization's destruction. We preserved ourselves not out of cowardice, but in hope that someday we might find allies worthy of the knowledge we've gathered. The sanctuary held more than just the Luminar remnant. Scattered throughout the hidden system were representatives of dozens of supposedly extinct civilizations, scholars, warriors, artists, and dreamers who had escaped the systematic destruction of their worlds. They had spent centuries studying Vorthak tactics, technology, and psychology, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Serafina found herself in what could only be described as the galaxy's most exclusive library, where the collected knowledge of dead civilizations was preserved in quantum storage matrices. "They've been documenting everything," she reported to Zephyr with barely contained excitement. "Every battle, every conquest, every time someone found a weakness in Vorthak technology. It's all here." But the most significant discovery came from an unexpected source. Among the refugees was a being called the Architect, a former Vorthak military engineer who had defected centuries ago after witnessing the systematic genocide of a peaceful farming civilization. His knowledge of Vorthak technology and psychology was encyclopedic, and his guilt over his people's crimes had driven him to dedicate his existence to finding a way to stop them. "The Empire's strength lies in their absolute certainty," the Architect explained, his translated thoughts carrying deep shame and desperate hope. "They believe they are evolution's perfect endpoint, that their expansion is as inevitable as entropy itself. This certainty makes them powerful, but it also makes them blind to possibilities they cannot conceive." Thad spent his time in the Sanctuary's workshops, where refugee engineers from a dozen species had spent centuries perfecting technologies that could challenge Vorthak supremacy. Energy shields that could deflect their quantum disruptors, navigation systems that could predict their hyperspace interdiction fields, weapons that turned their own tactics against them. "It's beautiful," he said, running his hands over a device that seemed to exist in 7 dimensions simultaneously. "They've taken the fundamental principles of Vorthak technology and turned them inside out. Instead of using force to impose order, they're using harmony to create chaos." But the most important revelation came from Chitrix Neth, whose memory songs had been broadcasting their battle with Vorthak across the galaxy. The response had been unprecedented. Species that had hidden in fear for generations were beginning to remember that they had once been capable of resistance. "The hive songs speak of awakening," she harmonized with growing excitement. "On 47 worlds, the subjugated peoples are beginning to question their submission. The memory of defiance spreads like fire through the quantum foam that connects all thinking beings." Luminarch Kethari's electromagnetic thoughts took on an urgent quality. "This is the moment we have waited 3 centuries to witness. The Empire has grown too large, too confident. Their garrison forces are spread thin across thousands of systems, relying on fear and conditioning to maintain control. But fear, once broken, becomes rage." The plan that emerged from their discussions was audacious beyond reason. Rather than attempting to defeat the Vorthak Empire through conventional warfare, an impossibility given their technological and numerical superiority, they would strike at the psychological foundations of Vorthak power. They would prove to the galaxy that the Empire could be defied, that their technological supremacy was not absolute, and that resistance was possible. The target they chose was symbolic rather than strategic: the Museum of Conquest, a massive space station where Vorthak displayed artifacts from every civilization they had destroyed. It was heavily defended and strategically irrelevant, which made it the perfect place to make a statement that would resonate across every inhabited world. As the refugees of the Sanctuary began preparing their ships for the most desperate mission in galactic history, Zephyr found herself reflecting on how far they had come from that first distress signal. The Meridian's Edge was no longer just a human exploration vessel, she had become the flagship of a movement that transcended species, ideology, and the traditional boundaries of possible and impossible. "Captain," Serafina said, joining her at the observation deck where they could see the impossible beauty of the Sanctuary spread out before them, "I've been analyzing the psychological profiles of every species that's joined this alliance. Do you know what they all have in common?" "Hope," Zephyr suggested. "Close. They all remember what it feels like to be something other than victims." Serafina's eyes reflected the light of artificial stars. "That's what we gave them when we chose to fight instead of run. We reminded them who they used to be." The assault on the Museum of Conquest began not with weapons fire, but with something the Vorthak had never encountered in 3 centuries of expansion: a a coordinated psychological attack that turned their greatest strength into crippling weakness. As the combined fleet of refugee vessels approached the massive station, they broadcast something that should have been impossible, a unified song of resistance that reached across space to touch the minds of every sentient being within a dozen light-years. Chitrix Neth had woven together the memory songs of 47 extinct civilizations, creating a harmonic pattern that resonated with the quantum consciousness field connecting all intelligent life. The song told the story of defiance, not the hopeless last stands of dying worlds, but the moment when beings chose to fight regardless of the odds, to preserve something beautiful in the face of absolute destruction. Commander Vorthak himself led the defense of the museum, his dreadnought accompanied by the massed firepower of 17 escort vessels. His tactical displays showed the approaching refugee fleet, a motley collection of obsolete ships and hastily retrofitted civilian vessels that any logical analysis would dismiss as negligible threats. But something was wrong with his crew's performance. Response times were slower than normal, targeting solutions seemed less precise, and several officers had requested medical attention for symptoms that had no apparent cause. Status report on fleet coordination, Vorthak commanded, his voice carrying the cold authority that had cowed 1,000 worlds. Sir, we're experiencing minor technical difficulties with neural interface synchronization, his tactical officer reported, confusion evident even through the universal translator. Bridge crew efficiency is down by 12% and continuing to decline. What the Vorthak couldn't understand was that their greatest evolutionary advantage, the collective consciousness that allowed perfect coordination and absolute tactical precision, had become a vulnerability. The refugees' song was introducing chaotic patterns into their shared mental network, forcing individual Vorthak to confront thoughts and emotions they had been bred to suppress. Aboard the Meridian's edge, Serafina monitored the psychological warfare with growing excitement. "It's working better than we hoped," she reported. The Vorthak collective consciousness is designed to filter out doubt, fear, and individual initiative. But those are exactly the qualities needed to respond to truly unprecedented situations. THAAD had performed miracles with their ship systems, integrating luminar energy matrices with human engineering in ways that violated every known principle of technological compatibility. The result was a vessel that seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime, capable of maneuvers that sent Vorthak targeting computers into recursive calculation loops. "Their weapons can't hit what their computers can't comprehend," he explained, his hands dancing across controls that now responded to thought as much as touch. "We're not just breaking their technology, we're breaking their entire conceptual framework for how physics should work." The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Instead of the methodical exchanges of fire that characterized Vorthak conquests, space erupted into a chaotic dance where refugee vessels seemed to appear and disappear at will, where energy beams curved around impossible geometries, and where the fundamental laws of cause and effect seemed subject to artistic interpretation. The turning point came when the architect's personal vessel, the Redemption's Price, broke through the Vorthak defensive perimeter and reached the museum itself. The station was more than just a repository of stolen artifacts, it was a quantum consciousness projector that broadcast the Empire's version of history to every conquered world, constantly reinforcing the myth of Vorthak inevitability. "I built this station," the architect transmitted as his ship began its final approach. "I designed its defenses to be impregnable against any conventional attack. But there's one weakness I built into its core systems, something I hoped I would never need to use." His sacrifice was both devastating and beautiful. Instead of destroying the museum with conventional weapons, the architect activated a quantum resonance cascade that turned the station's own consciousness projector against the Vorthak collective mind. For the first time in their species' history, every Vorthak in the galaxy experienced what their victims felt, the terror of helplessness, the grief of loss, the desperate hope that someday the universe might be different. The psychological shock paralyzed the Empire's forces just long enough for something unprecedented to happen. On conquered worlds across the galaxy, subjugated populations began to remember that they had once been free. The uprising wasn't coordinated or planned, it was a spontaneous expression of collective awakening that spread faster than hyperspace communication. But victory came at a terrible cost. The Redemption's price was destroyed in the quantum cascade, taking the Architect with it. 7 other refugee vessels were lost to Vorthack weapons before the enemy fleet began its confused retreat. And the museum itself, along with 3 centuries of accumulated cultural artifacts from dead civilizations, was reduced to drifting debris and quantum ghosts. Luminarch Kethari's electromagnetic thoughts carried deep sadness mixed with triumph. The Architect's sacrifice has given us what we needed, not military victory, but proof that the Empire can be defied. The song of resistance now echoes in every Vorthack mind, and they will never again feel the certainty that made them invincible. As the refugee fleet regrouped in the aftermath of battle, reports began filtering in from across the galaxy. 17 worlds had declared independence from the Empire. Vorthack garrison forces were requesting reinforcements to deal with widespread civil unrest. And most significantly, several Vorthack ships had simply stopped responding to Imperial commands, their crews apparently paralyzed by the unfamiliar experience of individual doubt. Zephyr stood on the bridge of the Meridian's edge, looking out at the debris field that had once been the Museum of Conquest. They had won something more valuable than territory or resources. They had broken the psychological chains that bound the galaxy to accept its own oppression. Captain, Chitrixneth harmonized softly, the memory songs speak of a new verse being written. The humans and their allies have shown that even the mightiest empire is only as strong as the fear it can inspire. And fear, once broken, cannot easily be rebuilt. But even as they celebrated their victory, Zephyr knew this was only the beginning. The Vorthack Empire still controlled most of the galaxy, and their technology remained superior to anything the refugees could field. What they had won was something more precious and more fragile: hope. Now they had to prove that hope could survive the long war ahead. 6 months after the Museum of Conquest fell, the galaxy had transformed into something unrecognizable. What began as isolated uprisings had evolved into a complex web of resistance networks, refugee sanctuaries, and free worlds that defied every prediction about how galactic politics should function. The Vorthack Empire, which had ruled through absolute certainty for 3 centuries, found itself struggling to maintain control over populations that no longer believed in their inevitability. Zephyr stood in the command center of Haven Station, a mobile base constructed from the merged hulls of dozens of refugee vessels. The station moved constantly through hyperspace, never staying in one system long enough for Imperial forces to locate and destroy it. Around her, representatives of 57 species worked together in a symphony of organized chaos that would have given Vorthack military planners nightmares. The liberation of Kepler 438 is proceeding ahead of schedule, reported Mishkavel, whose compound eyes now reflected strategic displays showing real-time battle data from across the galaxy. The local Vorthack garrison surrendered after only 6 hours of fighting. Their collective consciousness is still experiencing what human psychology texts call cascade doubt syndrome. Serafina looked up from her analysis station, where she had been monitoring the psychological effects of their unconventional warfare. "It's spreading faster than we hoped and in ways we didn't anticipate," she said, her voice carrying both excitement and concern. The quantum resonance from the museum is still propagating through the Vorthack collective mind. Individual units are beginning to question not just their orders, but their entire worldview. But the cost of their success was mounting. Thad's latest medical reports showed the toll that constant hyperdimensional travel was taking on human physiology. The modifications he had made to their ship systems were slowly killing them at the cellular level, their bodies unable to fully process the exotic energies they were channeling. "I can keep us functional for maybe another year," he admitted privately to Zephyr, his weathered face showing exhaustion that went deeper than mere physical fatigue. "After that, the quantum degradation will be irreversible. We'll burn out like candles, but what a light we'll make." The strategic situation was even more complex than their personal challenges. The Vorthack Empire had begun adapting to the new reality, implementing increasingly desperate measures to maintain control. Worlds that showed signs of rebellion were being subjected to purification protocols, systematic extermination designed to eliminate resistance at its source. We're forcing them to become monsters, Luminarch Kethari observed, her electromagnetic thoughts heavy with moral complexity. Our success is saving some worlds while dooming others to genocidal retaliation. Every life we liberate is balanced against lives lost to imperial desperation. The moral weight of their choices became crystallized in a single moment when they received a transmission from the Kalos system, one of the first worlds to join their resistance movement. The planetary governor, a being called Nexus Prime who had organized the uprising against local Vorthak forces, spoke with the calm dignity of someone who had already accepted death. The Imperial fleet has arrived, Nexus Prime transmitted, his modulated harmonics translated into words that barely conveyed the underlying emotions. 57 dreadnoughts carrying purification matrices. We estimate 4 billion beings will die in the next 18 hours unless we surrender unconditionally. The choice before them was impossible. Haven Station and its refugee fleet could potentially break the Imperial blockade and evacuate perhaps 1 million beings before the purification began. But doing so would expose their location to Imperial forces and almost certainly doom their entire movement to destruction. Chitrix spoke the truth that none of them wanted to acknowledge. The memory songs teach us that legends are born from impossible choices. We can save many worlds by sacrificing one, or we can save one world and watch our movement die. Either choice will haunt the survivors for generations. Zephyr felt the weight of command settle on her shoulders like a shroud. In the months since they had first encountered the Nethys refugees, she had watched her small exploration crew transform into something approaching mythical figures. Their names were whispered in the underground networks of a dozen species. Children on liberated worlds drew pictures of the Meridian's edge dancing between the stars. They had become symbols of hope for an entire galaxy. But symbols, she was learning, were not people. The woman who had left Earth to explore the universe had been replaced by something harder and more terrible, a figure who could order billions to die for the greater good and somehow still sleep at night. We go to Kalos, she announced, her voice cutting through the discussions and arguments with the finality of a sword stroke. Not to evacuate, but to make a stand. If we're going to be legends, we might as well be the kind worth believing in. The battle for Kalos would be remembered across the galaxy as the moment when hope died and was reborn in the same instant. Haven Station and its refugee fleet arrived in system just as the Vorthak purification began, their ships emerging from hyperspace into a vision of hell. Orbital bombardment platforms were systematically destroying cities while civilian evacuation ships were hunted down by fighter squadrons that showed no mercy to the fleeing innocent. What followed was less a battle than a masterpiece of desperate artistry. The refugee fleet scattered across the system like seeds in a cosmic wind, each ship becoming a beacon of resistance that drew Imperial fire away from civilian targets. They couldn't win, the mathematics of the situation made that impossible, but they could ensure that the Vorthak paid such a price that purification protocols would become strategically unviable. The Meridian's edge made her final stand in the shadow of Kalos Prime, her hull blazing with energies that should have been impossible. Thad had overloaded every system beyond the point of no return, transforming their exploration vessel into a quantum anomaly that existed partially outside normal spacetime. "Captain," Serafina said softly, her hands steady on controls that were melting under the exotic energies flowing through them, "it's been an honor exploring the impossible with you." As Vorthak dreadnoughts converged on their position, their weapons charging for a final overwhelming salvo, Zephyr smiled. They had lost the battle, but won something more important. They had proven that even in the face of certain defeat, someone would choose to stand and fight. The quantum cascade that destroyed the Meridian's edge took 7 Vorthak dreadnoughts with it, but more importantly, it sent a message that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. 27 years had passed since the Battle of Kalos, and the galaxy had settled into a new equilibrium that would have been unimaginable during the height of Vorthak dominance. The Empire still existed, controlling roughly a third of known space, but they had learned to coexist with the reality of resistance. The Confederation of Free Worlds had grown from a desperate alliance of refugees into a thriving civilization spanning thousands of systems. And in the dark spaces between galaxies, the sanctuary continued its patient work of preserving knowledge and preparing for whatever challenges the universe might offer. On a small world called Haven's Rest, an elderly being that was once known as Mishkavel tended a garden where plants from 47 different species grew in impossible harmony. Her compound eyes had dimmed with age, but her memory remained perfect, and young beings from across the galaxy came to hear her tell the stories of the time of legends. The humans lasted less than a year after first contact, she would say, her harmonics carrying both sorrow and wonder. Their bodies couldn't process the quantum energies they used to perform their miracles. But in those few months, they changed the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. They proved that compassion could be stronger than fear, that hope could survive any defeat, and that sometimes the most important battles are the ones where victory is impossible. In the research archives of New Lumina, Dr. Serafina Voss's complete xenobiological records were studied by scholars who still struggled to understand how she had mapped the psychology of an entire empire in the span of a few desperate battles. Her notes on Vortak collective consciousness had become the foundation for new theories about the nature of shared awareness and individual identity. She saw patterns that others missed, explained Professor Tethys Null, whose own research into quantum consciousness had been inspired by Serafina's work. While everyone else was studying Vortak technology, she was studying Vortak psychology. She understood that their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness, their inability to conceive of truly irrational behavior. Thaddeus Marlowe's engineering innovations had been implemented across the Confederation, though always with strict safety protocols that he himself had ignored in those final desperate months. Ships now carried quantum shields based on his modifications to the Meridian's edge, and hyperspace navigation had been revolutionized by his discovery that machines could think in ways their builders never intended. The human engineer understood something we had forgotten, observed Chief Designer Corlin of the Arcturus shipyards. Technology doesn't have to be perfect to be effective. Sometimes the most important innovations come from doing things wrong in exactly the right way. But it was Captain Zephyr Kane whose legend had grown the largest, and whose memory carried the most complex burden of meaning. Statues of her stood in the capitals of free worlds, but they were not monuments to victory. Instead, they commemorated the moment when someone chose principle over pragmatism, when courage was measured not by success but by the willingness to stand for something greater than survival. Chitrix Neth, now ancient even by Nethi standards, had become the living repository of the memory songs. Her hive harmonics carried the stories of all the species that had contributed to the Great Awakening, but she always returned to the tale of 3 humans who had answered a distress signal and changed the course of galactic history. They came from a young species that knew nothing of our wars, she would sing to gatherings of children whose grandparents had never known freedom. They had no reason to care about our struggles, no obligation to risk their lives for strangers. But when they saw suffering, they chose to act. When they faced impossible odds, they chose to fight. When victory became impossible, they chose to stand. The Vortak Empire itself had been transformed by the cascade doubts that still occasionally rippled through their collective consciousness. While they remained a military power, they were no longer driven by the absolute certainty that had once made them unstoppable. Some Vortak had even defected to the Confederation, bringing with them technologies and perspectives that enriched the growing alliance. Former Commander Vortak, now calling himself simply the Penitent, lived in exile on a monastery world where he spent his days transcribing the histories of the species his forces had destroyed. His memoirs had become required reading for students of military ethics, a devastating account of how absolute power corrupts even those who believe themselves to be serving evolution itself. The humans taught us that strength without wisdom is merely destruction, he wrote in his final entry. We thought we were the culmination of galactic evolution, but we were merely another dead end. The future belongs not to the strongest, but to those who remember that strength exists to serve life, not to dominate it. In the deepest archives of the sanctuary, where quantum storage matrices preserved the memories of extinct civilizations, a new wing had been constructed. The human memorial contained everything that could be recovered about Earth's lost children, their personal logs, their technical specifications, their final transmissions as they burned in the quantum fire of their own impossible courage. Visitors often remarked on the size of the memorial, how such a small space could be dedicated to beings who had such a large impact on galactic history. But Luminarch Kethari, whose electromagnetic thoughts now carried the wisdom of 4 centuries, would gently correct them. "You misunderstand the nature of legends," she would explain. "The humans were not important because of what they accomplished, but because of what they chose to become. In a galaxy that had forgotten the meaning of hope, they remembered. In a universe that accepted suffering as inevitable, they said no. They were explorers to the end, not of new worlds, but of new possibilities for what thinking beings could choose to be." On quiet nights, when the quantum winds carried whispers between the stars, some claimed they could still hear the Meridian's edge dancing through hyperspace, her crew forever young and forever defiant, reminding the galaxy that some things were worth more than survival, some principles more important than victory, and some choices so beautiful that they echoed across eternity itself. The humans had come seeking knowledge and found instead the greatest discovery of all, that in a universe of infinite cruelty and infinite beauty, the choice of how to respond belonged to each individual consciousness, and that choice, once made with sufficient courage, could reshape the very foundations of reality. They had become legends not through conquest, but through connection. Not through victory, but through the simple, radical act of caring about strangers. And in the quantum songs that now connected every free world in the galaxy, their voices could still be heard, singing the eternal anthem of beings who chose hope in the face of impossible darkness.